go over here and we'll do the welcome. Good. So we're really this week we're on part 2 of the 8 woes. Although in a lot of modern Bibles you only find 7, as we looked at last week. I can understand where perhaps where the 8th one crept in from. We looked at that last time, so I won't try and redo it now. But as I put at that point, it becomes a nice balance. This is the last public address that Jesus is ever going to give. It's not the last piece of teaching or sermon, because he's going to go out, and in the afternoon of the same day, he's going to talk to his disciples about the end of the age, the destruction of the temple, and so on. What we sometimes talk about as the apocalyptic sermon. So it's not the last thing he teaches, but it's the last public address. And this final public address, which you see matched with his first public address, which starts with 8 blessings, here we find 8 woes, 8 things to watch out for. And that's perhaps the best way of understanding them. They are things that Jesus highlights in the context of the way the Pharisees behave. But he is talking to Pharisees. It's very easy to it can sound as though Jesus is fully antagonistic towards the Pharisees. But particularly if we draw in Luke's gospel, we'll find in the final phase of Jesus' ministry, when he's relocated down to the south around Judea, there are increasing numbers of Pharisees and Pharisee teachers who are now following Jesus. And in many ways, what Jesus is trying to get across now is the things that have crept into Pharisaism that will become a conflict. And interestingly, most of the things that are covered, as we're seeing in the woes, are things that the church needs to deal with quite regularly as well. So in that sense, it's not a kind of a total stand against. It is a warning against, actually, if you get drawn into these things that can seem reasonable, but they can lead you in the wrong ways. And so we're going to start by completing this cycle of 8 woes, and then we're going to draw in some things which have some implications for the way in which we read and understand, if you like, the way in which Scripture is living and active, and the way in which Scripture speaks prophetically, because they take a slightly broader context than purely a kind of a foretelling of this happened and therefore this happened at some point in the future. We're going to see a kind of broader stitching together of ideas from different sources. You'll see what I mean when we get there. So that will come at the end. So I didn't want to do all of the 8 woes in one go, because it's a long kind of period, and they started with some stuff that needed a little bit more information on, a little bit more kind of connecting to the Sermon on the Mount, the beginning of Jesus' ministry. As we finish, we're going to see they kind of touch into some things which are worth wider consideration too. So we're at verse 23, so following the same formula we were looking at the end of last week. We're starting with woe number 5. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. So same formula. For you pay tithes of mint and dill and cumin, and you've neglected the weightier aspects of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. Now, these you should have done, i.e., the weightier things, while not ignoring these other things. The word "other things" is actually those other things. It's all really a contraction of the word "those," but it's kind of just making it clear in English. We should have done the weighty things while not neglecting the smaller things. And there's an interesting tension in first of all, a really important thing to see here, which is there's a reflection of Jesus' approach to the revelation contained in Scripture. We've touched on this several times as we see Jesus' words. He has a wise approach. He notices certain passages, if you like, of being of more significance than others. And that's an important thing to get our heads around. While we can't be dogmatic and say the things I prioritize are de facto the exact things, it's much more kind of common that people don't know how to prioritize between different aspects. That actually we see within Scripture itself, if you like, a reevaluation of what's gone before, and a kind of a separating into what God was saying that was relevant across all time, and what he was saying that was there in the moment. So there isn't a kind of a foolish sort of sense, which you do hear sometimes from folk, which is because God's eternal and knows eternal truth, everything that he's ever said is eternally true for all contexts and circumstances. But of course the people who say that don't live by things like let the alien among you first be circumcised, as if it somehow has the same eternal nature as something like thou shalt not murder, you see. But actually just to see that Jesus takes that sort of approach, and we're having a similar thing here. He's not being critical of the tithing of mint, dill and cumin, the place of garden herbs. And I think it's really interesting, particularly coming from a Western tradition, where we have a very kind of strong sense through the Protestant Reformation of salvation by faith, not by works. Therefore, very often we've lost the nuance of but works without action. Faith without works is dead, because we've kind of got the two confused and so on. But within that mix, in the kind of freedoms we often have, we're often very comfortable as Christians working with the broad concepts, the weightier matters now. Thou shalt not murder. That seems weightier to us. And the small things, well, that's more trivial. I'm reassessing from a sort of psychological point of view that split. Just in the last while, we've been working through Alpha in our church, we've been working through the Cantonese version of Alpha, because we've got 9 or 10, I think it's 11 total, Cantonese speakers going in that Alpha program. And one of the things that comes out in the discussion is in the Chinese context, there isn't a history. If you like, religion is often seen in the small processes. If you like, the way in which you sacralize, if I can use that word, you sacralize every kind of moment of every day by finding little things that you do with it. And so they have a tradition of prayer, of meditation, and so on. But what they don't have is significant religious leaders. Even people, when you put them out there, which I've done with the group, people like Confucius, you might think has a slightly more theological implication in some of the things he taught. It's just not the same. So they're very often their experience coming into Christianity is they're coming in relationally, seeing something that works, but they're coming in through the processes and practices of service and of prayer and so on, and then you're introducing in some of the theological framework, and that becomes a sort of secondary nature. And I think there's something that to try and see here when Jesus says that the first thing, the tithing of these small things, it's not irrelevant, but it's just not the priority. And that he doesn't say he does say you should still do these small things. You just shouldn't have ignored the weightier matters. And I just thought it's worth kind of drawing that out, because I think in some ways we have suffered by making, if you like, the more personally developed expressions of faith. We said, we don't want to turn that into a new work, so we ignore it. But actually it's often in those simple processes that we're actually bringing all of our lives into connection with our relationship with Jesus. So, for instance, the saying of grace before we eat a meal is taking something that is very instinctive, and our dogs always know when it's dinner time, and as soon as you put the food on the floor, they've scoffed it. So when we kind of add grace before we say a meal, we are kind of stopping for a second, and we're interrupting everything we do, and we are somehow pushing it under the grace and the relationship of the Lord. And what Jesus doesn't come to do is to kind of give us a detailed new law, but actually that doesn't dismiss the fact that actually for those who really grow in their spirituality, you'll find they have those habits of kind of prayer and observation and ways of doing things which are it's easy to kind of think, oh, well, it's just a religious habit, because it can become that, and not actually see, if you like, there can be a benefit to those. So I'm kind of almost arguing the second point. You should have done these while not ignoring those other things. Let's not ignore that actually it's not a bad place to get to a point where all of our lives we're doing conscious of our relationship with the Lord, even if it's down to as much as I take a bit of the mint that I grew in my garden and I kind of recognize that actually it's God's grace that I have this garden, and I'm giving this and gifting however I do it to Him. So there's a principle here, but then the other side is there are things that are more important. And actually, when we're thinking about us as a community within our church context, we want to build our togetherness based on the important things. And so that can sometimes still be a challenge for a church leader, because we need to pray about what's the Lord saying to us right now. How do we step forward on this? If we're going to step forward as a community, then all of us need to move on these things. So we're helping to prioritize. I just noticed, for those who like these structural things, there's Jesus puts the you pay tithes of mint. He joins with the little chi word, the Greek chi, mint and dill and cumin. There's a threesome there, and then he kind of contrasts that with justice, mercy, faithfulness. So here you've got your little three. You got your mint, you got your dill, you got your cumin. Those are small things, but there are these big things like justice, mercy, faithfulness. Interestingly, we have that flow a lot of times. As you'll see, the word faithfulness is just faith, but it can be either. And I've gone for faithfulness because it's more that sort of broad principle here in this kind of context. So there's a danger. There's something that, as I say, there's a woe here. We become hypocritical when we kind of get into the little things that are often more nuanced to do with my relationship with the Lord. They're not unimportant, because they're often the way my relationship is worked out with Jesus, to try and bring these simple ideas, the things I eat, the things I drink, the people I talk to, how I talk, what I do, bring them all into the relationship, all under the grace of the Lord. But we don't want to kind of turn those little habits into things that actually help us to ignore the big things around us, and the families that need real help, or the situation that actually requires someone to stand up and make a political claim on something. That while as a church we don't want to get sucked into a political solution, there are times when we have to stand with those who are being abused or mistreated in the systems. So all of those things are in process here, and Jesus then kind of illustrates it. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat while swallowing a camel. And I've always loved that image. I'm always surprised it hasn't made it onto more T-shirts. The kind of the contrast between the tiny gnat and the camel, there are those who, when Jesus talks about for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle is like a camel going through the eye of a needle, who worry that Jesus couldn't be literal then, and he must have been talking about a little gate called the eye of the needle, or he's talking about the camel's halter going through the eye of a needle. But I think that there is just something that in every culture understands. There's an amusing image with the idea of a camel, because they are great big fat ugly creatures that spit and make rude noises the whole time. But so there's kind of something of Jesus's humour in just the way he paints the picture, straining out the gnat and swallowing a camel, that we can sometimes obsess over things that we shouldn't. We sometimes don't give enough credence to the big things. And it's something for us always to be aware of. It creeps into church. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, you clean the outside of the cup and the dish. Now we're getting again into the realms of hypocrisy again. But inside are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee. So again, we're matching the same formula. Woe to scribes and Pharisees. Then it was blind guides, now blind Pharisee. First clean the inside of the cup and the dish, that their outside might become clean as well. So there is a kind of an order in the process. Start with the inside rather than start with the outside. Whereas most of us, it's easier. It's easier to present virtue than it is to be virtuous. So we often work on. We're all very good at presenting well. So we start from the outside and then hope to move in. And Jesus just warns us: you make that too much of a habit, and this is a woe. This is something that's you're going to lose something of the quality of the life that Jesus is giving you. So we need to start with the inner life. Now, in practical, because I often, as well as doing the teaching, I often want to share out of my practical experience of some of these things, is it's really interesting how in good churches, there is a desire almost within the community to not to want to hear about the changes and transformation of the way that God is dealing with your inner life. We would rather you kind of actually polished up the outside so that it can appear good while we're kind of conscious and happy with the fact that you're getting on and sorting these things out. Now, I get that. I understand why that is. But sometimes it can become an unhelpful thing. So sometimes someone who the Lord is dealing with their inside life first, who doesn't yet have, if you like, the cultural skill to hide some of that process, can actually sometimes end up effectively being ostracized by a church situation. So I want to be careful, because it can sound then like, as a church leader, that you're kind of being permissive to a community that is in the process of change. It's not that you're trying to be permissive, but you're being real about how, if the Lord is bringing people in from a very broken world with all sorts of issues, sometimes some will come in and actually have a greater display, and somehow we have to have a grace to allow the truth of the inner life to be out there so that it can be challenged and shaped up. Whereas if I've had a very nice middle class upbringing, I might be seething with sorts of things inside, but I'm probably very skilled at creating that outside layer. So it's just a kind of a comment in the mix as to why these things perhaps are important. So woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, you're like whitewashed tombs. Again, we've got this sense of the difference between what's outside and what's inside. Certainly you look beautiful on the outside. See, now there's a difference here between the last one. In the last woe, it was a question of the outside being cleaned, but the inside not being cleaned, and actually clean the inside, then clean the outside. Now it looks clean on the outside, but actually, but the inside is full of dead bones and all sorts of uncleanness. In other words, in Judean tombs, there were communal tombs, which you left the bones in those communal tombs while the flesh literally rotted off them. The putrefied flesh rots off them. Once the flesh is all rotted off a set of bones, you remove them from the tomb and you put them into an ossuary, which you can bring into the house or you can do other things with, because it's all gone. So these whitewashed tombs, very literally, are full of rotting flesh. They've got the bones there, and the bones are gradually all the organic tissue on the bones is rotting away. So there's the difference here is now they look good on the outside, but it's not just that the inside is being cleaned slower. The inside is actually getting worse. It's rotting off. So there's that challenge of actually you've come in and you can present now the outside. You know how to do it. What's going on in the inside. So likewise, you also appear righteous to people outwardly, but inside you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. And almost all of us will know people who have gone through this process, that for ages they look, things look very smooth on the outside, and when suddenly that the failure of what's out there, you discover there's been a rot going on for quite a long process, quite a long time. And I don't want to ever sound judgmental, so it's very cautious, because I don't want to tell stories but sadly we've seen those folks, and it's always a difficult thing as to what level have they lost faith, or rejected faith. Were they always saved or never saved? All of those kind of questions that come up. But we tend to know, we've had that experience of people who seem so together on the outside, but somehow the fact that the inside hasn't been cleaned originally, and they've been maintained for a long period, and it's not just that they're nice people or not nice people, but it's somehow their Christian life looks together, and yet when it goes, you often find that the things have been going on for a long period. So again, it's something we do want to be wary of, not to be judgmental of, but to be wary of within our own context and with the people around us. And we want to have a level of honesty that somehow allows transformation to really happen in people, less driven by external standards, but actually by inner change. Put it those ways. We get coming towards the end of the list of woes now, and then we're going to come on to some of the things that Jesus says interestingly, which kind of which help us to stretch our understanding of the way prophecy and the Bible works. So woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets. So you notice the way Jesus says everything's kind of linked by a basic idea. We started with the tithing of small things, and actually that's valuable. It's not trivial. Don't throw it away. But you've got to focus on the big things. Then we meant from those small things and one of those is you in that small things you've been you're straining out the gnat. Now here's the big camel. That's kind of hypocritical. So you've then had this kind of focusing on as you tip your wine through and you strain out the gnat because you don't want to eat that'd be unclean, but you miss the camel, which will also make you unclean. So we've had a cup here, and now we're talking about cleaning of outsides and insides of cups. You see the idea is kind of one connect to the other. Are you cleaning the inside rather than the outside? Is the outside being done first, and is it really unclean on the inside? Then the inside and outside, we've then gone into tombs, because they've been painted nice and white on the outside, but it's real putrefaction on the inside. And now we're talking about tombs and how we honour those tombs. So you can see how the things all kind of build together without it being exactly a logical flow. It's more of an association flow. So now moving on, you build the tombs of the prophets, which are all nice and white, and you decorate the monuments of the righteous, and you say if we'd lived in the days of our fathers, we wouldn't have been partners with them in the blood of those prophets. So the prophets who regularly have been persecuted, of course, by the very ancestors of those who are now here in Jesus' day, but who take and festoon those things and do things to honour their monuments and their tombs. But then Jesus kind of makes, so you confess about yourselves that you are the children of those who murdered the prophets, and you fill up the measure of your fathers. And so you can't help being those things, but you do acknowledge that you are those things. And he leaves them with this challenge as to you're now filling up the same measure. And then what Jesus does is he then illustrates, that's right, the next verse here. So serpents, brood of vipers, how are you going to escape the accusation of Gehenna? Jesus is introducing a theme that roots back to the prophecies of Jeremiah. The reason I mention that is we'll see how in Jewish thinking these things all connect together. Gehenna becomes a part of the prophetic context of Jeremiah's prophecy, which of course with the destruction of Jerusalem, the valley of Hinnom gets filled with bodies and so on and so forth. And that some of this prophecy is going to creep into what we're looking at over the next couple of weeks when we're thinking about the coming destruction of Jerusalem and so on. So there is an accusation of Gehenna or a judgment of Gehenna. There is something that Gehenna represented historically, the valley of Hinnom, and actually it's coming again. Jesus started to raise it as an anticipation. How are you going to escape what that represented? That place of judgment that actually looks terrible and looks like there's no way out of. And Jesus now gives a context which is going to be worked out over the next couple of decades because of this watch now. Or behold, I've gone for watch now. So in other words, you guys notice this. I'm going to send to you prophets. I will, it's coming, prophets, wise men and scribes. Some of them you'll kill and crucify, and some you'll flog in your synagogues, and you'll persecute them from town to town. Well, we read about all of those things, of course, in the book of Acts. Paul is flogged in the synagogues. Stephen is executed. Paul actually, before he's Paul, is Saul. He's part of the persecution from town to town. So there is actually a very immediate kind of context why I think Jesus draws out that watch now. I'm going to show you what I've just illustrated to you. You say you wouldn't have done, but now you've got to work out, would you or wouldn't you? Are you not just a son of your father's in terms of genetic heritage? Are you also spiritually going to belong to them? And actually, there's a challenge to you. Now, I always think with these challenges, there may well have been those standing there who, in the testimony of the things that happened, will have heard these verses, and actually, because they've heard of them, it actually leads to their salvation, which is a wonderful truth in those little historical kind of moments, that actually these words of Jesus, let's believe that they actually had fruit because they're there as a warning. That just as in, like with the story of Jonah, declarations of God's judgment are warnings to help you escape his judgment. So, the way those things work. So actually, by spelling these things out, there are possibilities that actually it leads to people recognizing what's happening. And again, I think these things you see in mission history. Time and time again, there are those who in the early phases are participating in the persecution, and some point they kind of start to realize something, and actually they find their way very often through extravagant grace or some miraculous kind of testimony that comes to them, and actually find their whole lives turned around, very similar to Paul. And Paul is and Jesus is kind of anticipating what Paul stands for as a typology here. To come, but he's going to be sending folks out. There's going to be martyrdom going on in place, and those things. I always like the fact, for instance, that that modern missions really starts with a guy, if you like, theologically, Raymond Lull or Raimundo Lalo, I think, how it's said, and he dies from wounds that occur to him, and he's trying to minister into Algeria into just trying to think what regions of North Africa it was. But I always remember some years back when I was researching a little bit, I went onto Wikipedia, and there was a little thing in Wikipedia back then, I know these things change, which talks about how the Christian church in these areas goes back further than most places in North Africa. And it was the very places that actually Raymond Lull had inflicted the wounds that actually led to his death. He managed to make it onto the boat but died afterwards. And it's that kind of almost the testimony of those who've been sent, who do get flogged, killed. And as we're going to see, there is something of the blood that cries out from those. But here Jesus is giving it a warning to those who might participate in these very things. But he transitions, is what he's saying, his final things. So upon you will become all of the righteous blood shed on earth, and from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. And truly I tell you, all these things will come upon this generation. And they do, as we touched on, we find them all there in the book of Acts, and within a generation, the judgment of Gehenna, which is reenacted with the destruction of Jerusalem. So we're beginning to, although this is to the public, we're beginning to get the themes that Jesus is now going to expound in the coming weeks, in the coming hours, when it happened in real history, in the afternoon of when he talks about this in the morning, he's going to explain with to his disciples, because they're going to ask, they've been prompted by this, tell us more about this. But I want to come, because this is the verse, of course, is an interesting one, because most of you will be aware, because most of the folks that come to these Bible training teaching sessions are yourselves people who have spent time studying Scripture different ways. And so most of the people will be very aware of the fact that Jesus makes this reference to Zechariah the son of Berechiah. But there's a little bit of it's sometimes people say, oh, Jesus made a mistake here. And you probably, because you're the kind of folks who come to these things, you probably got a solution, because several of them have been offered. But I want to kind of highlight a few of these ways. So it's not a really kind of killer observation from a non-Christian that Jesus sometimes seems to use the wrong name or whatever, as you may have heard it. We'll think about it in a second. But I'm going to show you that in the various ways of approaching this, it actually is an interesting way of understanding a little bit more the context of how Scripture is being used, certainly by the Jewish community that Jesus is speaking into at the time, and more broadly, there's something of actually the prophetic which we find embedded in Scripture. So it's not just in the rabbinic ideas. And so it's worth kind of looking at several of the ways in which this is resolved, because they kind of give you hints into things. So although I only do this occasionally, I've drawn some stuff together. So Zechariah the son of Berechiah is Zechariah the prophet, who is the second to last of the minor prophets, who appears right at the end of our Bibles, just before Malachi, or the Old Testament, just before Malachi. And there's a kind of a nice thing, because obviously, if I go back, the blood of Abel starts with an A, the blood of Zechariah starts with a Z. Just somehow or other in English, it's kind of the A to Z of martyrdom is kind of illustrated. But equally, we look at it prophetically, that we've got Zechariah the son of Berechiah. So I put the quote from Zechariah 1, in the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius, Yahweh's word came to Zechariah the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo the prophet, saying, see? So he's a prophet. He's at the end of the Old Testament. There's only Malachi who comes later as a prophet. But here's the thing, there is actually no story about his death recorded in the Old Testament. So he might have died, but we don't have any record or assumption. Well, we'll see a little bit. There's a semi kind of assumption in the rabbinic writings, but on the other hand, we do know that Zechariah the son of Jehoiada, the priest who lived several hundred years before Zechariah the son of Berechiah, he is martyred. He actually gets martyred in what is the final book of the Old Testament in the Jewish book order. So 2 Chronicles is the final book in the way that the Old Testament is arranged historically in Judaism. So in a similar way to the way in which we have an A to Z or beginning to end, this Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest, is actually, and here's the thing, when you look at the details, it looks very much like Jesus is speaking about him. So this is 2 Chronicles, this is the record of it, 2 Chronicles 24, the Spirit of God came on Zechariah, ... So they conspired against him. This is the leaders of the Sanhedrin, the people, the very same people who conspire against Jesus, but not identical people, but the same community. And at the command of the king, they stoned him to death in the court of the house of the Lord. And as he died, he said, "May the Lord see and avenge." And those words that he speaks out become a kind of a motif within the rabbinic writings and their considerations. This is taken from a rabbinic writing, the Lamentation of Rabbah, which the late Midrashic tradition, which is i.e. post Jesus, but records ideas and things. So we can't say 100% that this predates Jesus or comes from Jesus' time, but it could do, and it's representative, although it was not written down till later. But here we have Rabbi Yehuda asked Rabbi Akkar, this is often the way these things are done, where did Israel slay Zechariah, in the court of the women or in the court of Israel? So the question is, and he replied, in neither of these, but it happened in the court of the priests. Now that's interesting, so just pointing these things out. Because if I go back, we know that it's in the court of the house of the Lord, but Chronicles doesn't tell us exactly where. But the court of the priests matches what Jesus says, between the altar and hang on, let's go back. Where did I have the actual? Let's get the wording right. And between the temple, the murder between the temple and the altar. You see. So in other words, as you're in the temple and you're heading towards the altar, and it's right there. The court of the priests is a good description of the way Jesus describes it. So although it's not there in Chronicles, that we see in this kind of common understanding that this is where Zechariah the son of Jehoiada is, which seems to match the way Jesus describes it in this position, except that Zechariah the son of Jehoiada is not the same person as Zechariah the son of Berechiah. And the tradition goes on to tell us actually how then the blood of Zechariah cried out against the rulers of Jerusalem. I haven't put a slide in for this, but I'll explain it quickly. In the same process, when they describe how when Nebuchadnezzar comes and conquers the people, besieges Jerusalem, breaks in, and so on, he comes in and discovers that there's blood bubbling, you see, at the altar. And they say, well, this is the blood because the blood of every sacrifice is like this. And so he gets them to offer a sacrifice to kind of appease the blood that's bubbling. And it still keeps bubbling. And they confess that they killed Zechariah, you see. And so Nebuchadnezzar kills them, but the blood keeps bubbling. And he asks eventually a kind of a question of what does he need to do to stop, if you like, the offended blood crying out from the ground, similar to Abel. Abel talks about when Abel's blood crying out from the ground. How do I appease this? And the answer is that it can never be appeased because it's so terrible. Although in asking the question, what actually happens is it all dies down. So it's a long passage. That's why I've not tried to stick it in here. But it makes a lot of sense of the kind of something of the context. And even Jesus' own death and so on, which then in the end is enough to appease, if you like, the blood of all these sacrifices, the blood of all sin, blood of all evil, and so on. But then what gets interesting, so anyway, sorry, keeping an eye on the time. Okay, so there are those that will say, well, when we don't know how Zechariah the son of Berechiah died, so let's assume he dies not dissimilar between the blood, the altar and in the temple and before the altar. Let's assume it's similar to the other Zechariah, and so therefore, if he did, although we have no record of it, that's who Jesus was referring to. You see, but all of the rabbinic history kind of fills out and creates a sense of significance, but related to a previous. Zechariah, who's not the son of Berechiah, he's the son of Jehoiada. But what you actually find in the Targums is that the Targums actually conflate the two characters. Now that doesn't necessarily help solve things, but it starts to illustrate something. So in the Targums, they're making a comment on Lamentations 2:20, which of course Jeremiah writes the book of Lamentations. Lamentations, where it says, should the priest and the prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? Now, remember, Jeremiah, let's get it right. Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, is a priest, but he's not a prophet, but he is martyred in the house of the Lord. Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, is a prophet. We don't know that he's a priest. Here we got, should the priest and the prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord in Lamentations? In a Targum, which is an explanation, a kind of teaching explanation, what actually happens is the two characters get fitted together. Is it fitting to murder in the house of the sanctuary of the Lord the priest and the prophet as you murdered Zechariah the son of Iddo? Now, Iddo is... Zechariah the son of Berechiah is the grandson of Iddo, and in Jewish thinking you can still call him the son of Iddo. So the Zechariah here is being referred to is the same one that is referred to by Jesus, and here it seems to be drawing in the story of Jehoiada, the previous one. Sorry, I'm losing track of myself here. So some will look at this, you see, and they've said, so probably here we have it's not in the Bible, but it's in the rabbinic writings, a testimony that actually Zechariah the son of Berechiah was the person here. But actually, as we've got to understand the rabbinic writings more, while that is certainly true, and that would fit the idea that Jesus is referring to Zechariah the prophet, and although we don't know about it in the Bible, he did die similarly to the previous one, so that could be a way of solving this. But as we've actually looked and understood the Targums more, we actually find a pattern which is not unique to here, and actually is a very useful thing of resolving a seeming contradiction in a couple of chapters' time, which is that the rabbinic understanding of the way the prophetic work often draws together events and ideas under the heading, if you like, of a key character who somehow represents them. So some of you will notice at the beginning of Mark's Gospel, there's a famous little bit where the most accurate biblical reading is this is the Gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God, Son of Abraham, Son of David, Son of David, Son of Abraham, according to the prophet Isaiah, and then Mark instantly quotes Malachi, you see, instead of Isaiah. So some translations don't have that. They say according to the prophets, full stop, because later translations got rid of the word Isaiah because it didn't seem to make sense, except that we now know, because we find it in the Targums very regularly, what's going on, which is Isaiah first introduces the idea of a messenger, and later Mark does quote from Isaiah. But then what it does is it conflates and draws in everybody else who's prophesied under that prophecy. So actually Malachi's prophecy of the voice in the wilderness are, if you like, a continuation spiritually of a theme that has been established by Isaiah, you see. So Isaiah talks about the voice in the wilderness. Malachi talks about the voice crying out in the wilderness, which is where the quote comes from. And the two become part of the same. So it's all now seen as part of the prophecy of Isaiah. It's not because the word of God is living and active and it continues and somebody else says it. You could see it as their words, but actually let's go back to source and it comes from Isaiah. You see, that's the way the thinking goes. And it actually helps resolve a number of little kind of weird quirks in the Bible when you understand this way of thinking. For instance, I think it's Psalm 34. The title, which most people ignore totally, refers to King Abimelech. But when you read the psalm, it's actually an event under King Achish. But King Achish is there a king within the Philistine area, which is often represented, we often hear about in Abimelech. It's kind of a common name, which means my God is king, or my father is king. Sorry, my father, not my God. And so, if you like, even in that title, Achish is being seen, if you like, as part of the same spirit, the same kind of prophetic thread. We're going to find as we move on. And so if we understand something of this going on here in the Targum, how do we resolve? So here is the text in Matthew. He refers to Zechariah and qualifies him as being son of Berechiah. But the things he describes seem to match the wider understanding, both in terms of the events, but also significance of the previous Zechariah. Here in the Targums, we see the same kind of conflation of the two, the events that we know of and the if you like, prophetic mystery that this person's death represents. Are now being associated with the more important character, Zechariah the prophet. They become a kind of a part. And you say, well, that's not quite the same prophetic flow, but we find this in other ways where the rabbis see a significance of the fact that the two have the same name and that they become part of the same testimony. And so the person themselves becomes a kind of a testimony for all of the ideas that are wrapped up in these things. And actually, as you see that broader way of understanding a kind of something of biblical prophecy and testimony, you see hints of stuff that aren't exactly precisely what we'd think of now as prophetic, but you can see how they all hang together around certain ways and characters. And it's an interesting way because it gives us several different ways of solving this strange conundrum. Because either Jesus got it wrong, which is what the critics say. He was really meaning to say Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, but he forgot and got it wrong. Or Matthew made a mistake in that when he was recording it, he kind of qualified. Jesus just said Zechariah. Matthew added son of Berechiah. Luke doesn't add, he gets it correct, he just records what Jesus said. But Matthew's doing what scribes often do, which is they often qualify more accurately for the reader than the speaker spoke. We do that in modern journalism all the time. when if Prime Minister is standing up talking about someone, he might refer to someone as John. When it's reported in the newspaper, we kind of clarify which John was in view. So reporting and commentating at the same time is an accepted and common understanding. So Matthew may have made the mistake, and certainly we find old manuscripts of Matthew that don't have that qualification in it. Or it might be that, as we see here in the rabbinic writings, this conflation here of the two characters means that the later Zechariah also suffered the same kind of fate as the earlier Zechariah. Or it might be that in a Jewish way of understanding of things, the whole story of the testimony of Zechariah has got tied to the prophet, the earlier priest, and is referred to kind of corporately under his heading. So you put all of those those things together. It's easier to ignore the last one because it's a little bit more complicated for our way of thinking. But we're going to find this same conflation of people and ideas with the prophetic threads actually is going to pop up again in Matthew 27. So it's worth us flagging it now. So Matthew 27 talks about the buying of the potter's field as fulfilling something from Jeremiah. But then it goes and quotes Zechariah as the fulfillment of something that Jeremiah has already, well, it doesn't say this, it says as fulfilling the prophet Jeremiah, and then it quotes 2 times about the 30 pieces of silver which I has valued, throw it to the potter, and so on. And all of those verses come from Zechariah. But with this same idea of drawing together things, what we do know is Jeremiah first prophesies about Gehenna and judgment, and he does so from a potter's warehouse, or not warehouse. He goes to the potter's house where things are being made. He buys a pot. He then breaks the pot and uses the whole. So he is the one who initiates the prophetic thread around the potter's field and the potter's house, the potter's wares. Zechariah then gives us more detail, but his detail is an extension of what's already been started by Jeremiah. You see. So you can see it's not just in this one place, it's something that appears in several places. It also makes sense that we find most of these things in Matthew. I quoted one earlier, the quoting of according to Isaiah and then quoting Malachi before we get to Isaiah. That's in Mark. Well, Mark is just recording the way Peter preached it, so it will reflect the way Peter says things. Luke, who avoids these kind of things because he's writing for a Gentile audience, and this is a very Jewish way of collecting things together, of joining them together. Matthew, which I've always seen as being the earliest gospel written, certainly early drafts of sermons being in Aramaic / Hebrew, is writing kind of fully within that kind of idiom, and so it's not surprising we often find these kind of things that look to us a little bit fuzzy. But in Matthew's gospel, so I'd kind of I include it here as part of the way of solving what's sometimes thrown as a criticism, but in a way that's not then just purely defensive, but actually helps us to start to understand and see in a slightly broader way in which the rabbinic writers and the testimony that they developed after the closing of the Old Testament with their understanding of the Messiah is often done using this technique of drawing threads together under a common head, which if you fully analyse them from a chronological point of view, they're sometimes separate, but they kind of become thematic, and here's the key representative of them. So we've taken a very long time, nearly a whole hour on this one, but and that last little bit was a bit that I thought was worth taking some time on. Hopefully it's kind of it's been interesting and worthwhile kind of working through. Does anyone want to ask any questions about that? 'Cause, I don't know if I've done it really clearly and got it across smoothly. And as I say, you don't have to therefore accept that as the solution. You could go a very simple way just to say, well, we assume that even though the Bible doesn't tell us, same thing happened to the Zechariah the prophet. But it's useful to see that the way in which the rabbis and the Targums draw these ideas together. So Jesus could well, therefore, have said Zechariah the son of Berechiah, and that would include the story of the killing of Zechariah the son of Jehoiada in the temple, in the way in which those things come together as a common testimony. And of course, they all come together in the sense of the two are actually tied, as we saw through the Targum, to the idea of the Valley of Hinnom as a sign of judgment, which is, of course, what Jesus is going to move on and teach about in the in the sermon, the apocalyptic sermon, which we're going to look at in the next couple of weeks. So there we go. Oops. So would anyone like to ask anything or make a comment at this stage?